The first transmission came through at 3:47 hours, cutting through the static like a scalpel through silk. It wasn't the words that made the radar operators lean forward in their chairs, coffee forgotten and cooling in their hands. It wasn't even the voice, though it carried a strange quality that would be discussed in hushed tones for years afterward. It was the silence that followed, heavy and deliberate, as if the sky itself had drawn breath and refused to release it. The command center at Nelly's Air Force Base hummed with subdued activity, screens casting pale blue light across focused faces. But in that moment, every eye turned toward the same display. A single contact, moving at speeds that defied the computer's initial calculations, vectoring in from coordinates that should have been empty Pacific sky. The operator, a tech sergeant with 7 years of night shifts behind him, reached for his handset with fingers that trembled just slightly. He had seen anomalies before, understood the difference between malfunction and reality. This was neither. This was something else entirely. His supervisor appeared behind him without sound, drawn by instinct more than alarm. Together, they watched the contact maintain its impossible trajectory, neither accelerating nor deviating, a statement written in radar returns and transponder codes that spelled out a call sign no one had spoken in 3 years. Valkyrie. The name hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood, carrying with it memories of an incident that had never been fully explained, a pilot who had simply vanished during what should have been a routine patrol, and questions that had been buried under classification stamps and official silence. Supervisor lifted his handset, his voice steady from years of training. "Tower, this is approach. We have an unscheduled contact, single aircraft, bearing 270, altitude Angels 40, speed Mach 1.8 and holding. Transponder is squawking Valkyrie actual. Advise." The response came back within seconds, but it was the pause before the words that told the real story. Everyone who had been there 3 years ago recognized that call sign. Everyone remembered the pilot who had worn it. And everyone knew with absolute certainty that Valkyrie's aircraft had gone down somewhere over the Philippine Sea, wreckage never recovered, black box never found, a file closed with the quiet efficiency of incidents too sensitive for proper burial. Yet here was her transponder code, painting across their screens as clearly as morning light. The tower's response, when it finally came, carried the weight of disturbed protocol. Approach tower. Authentication required. Challenge with current codes. The supervisor complied, transmitting the day's authentication sequence, knowing even as he did so that this was theater, a performance for procedures that no longer applied. The response came back immediately. The codes perfect, current, impossible. Somewhere in the darkness above the Nevada desert, something that identified itself as Valkyrie was coming home. Major Kestrel Thorne had been declared dead 27 months, 14 days, and 6 hours ago. The memorial service had been attended by 200 personnel, her dress uniform folded with precision into a display case that now occupied a place of honor in the squadron-ready room. Her parents had received the flag, the medals, the carefully worded letter from a general who had never met her but who understood the weight of sacrifice. The investigation had concluded equipment failure, probable cause determined to be catastrophic systems malfunction over open water, the kind of accident that occasionally claimed even the best pilots when technology and circumstance aligned in cruel synchronicity. The file had been sealed. The questions had been answered. The Air Force had moved on, as it always did, because the mission continued regardless of individual loss. But now those sealed files were being pulled from archives by officers whose faces showed the strain of interrupted sleep, and the questions were being asked again, though no one yet knew what answers they sought. In the command center, the contact-designated Valkyrie continued its approach, maintaining perfect course and altitude, responding to all challenges with codes that should not exist, piloting an aircraft that appeared on radar with a signature matching an F-35C that had been written off as destroyed. The base commander had been roused from his quarters, the wing commander was already in motion, and somewhere in the Pentagon, secure phones were beginning to ring with the insistent urgency of crisis unfolding. None of them had answers. They had only the evidence of their instruments and the impossible reality painting across their screens. Valkyrie was flying home. The question no one wanted to ask, but everyone was thinking, became unavoidable when the tower operator, a captain with 15 years of experience, spoke into his headset with careful precision. Valkyrie Tower, state your position and intentions. The response came after a pause that lasted 3 heartbeats, the voice unmistakably feminine, unmistakably calm, and unmistakably familiar to anyone who had ever flown with her. Tower Valkyrie. Request straighten approach, runway 21. I'm bringing her home. The operations center had transformed from routine midnight watch to crisis management in the span of minutes. Colonel Marcus Reeves stood at the central display, his jaw set in that particular expression that his subordinates had learned meant decisions were being calculated at high speed, variables weighed against unknowns, protocol balanced against intuition. He had known Kestrel Thorne, had signed off on her final mission brief, had stood at attention during her memorial service with the Nevada sun beating down on his dress blues. He remembered her as competent, professional, and possessed of a peculiar stubbornness that manifested not in rebellion, but in an absolute refusal to accept impossible as a final answer. She had been underestimated by every instructor she encountered during training, her slender frame and quiet demeanor reading as softness to those who confused volume with capability. They had learned, each in turn, that Kestrel Thorne did not argue with doubters. She simply proved them wrong, methodically and without ceremony, accumulating flight hours and qualifications until her record spoke louder than any defense she might have mounted. Now Reeves studied the radar return bearing her call sign and felt the weight of decisions that transcended normal operational parameters. "Get me visual confirmation," he ordered, his voice cutting through the subdued chaos of too many officers trying to manage a situation no one had trained for. "Scramble a flight of 2, intercept and identify. And someone wake up General Hadley. She's going to want to be here for this." The order rippled outward, setting bodies in motion, hands reaching for phones, voices speaking in the clipped urgent tones of professionals managing the extraordinary with the tools of the routine. On the flight line, Captain Isaiah Duran and First Lieutenant Mara Wolfe were already moving toward their aircraft when the scramble order came through. Duran had been dozing in the alert shack, boots on, flight suit already zipped, existing in that state of perpetual readiness that defined fighter pilots on standby rotation. Wolfe had been reviewing weather data, though her mind had been elsewhere, thoughts drifting toward the breakfast she would eat when the shift ended, and the phone call she owed her sister. The klaxon brought them both to full alertness instantly, muscle memory and training translating alarm into action without the delay of conscious thought. They reached their F-35 simultaneously, ground crews already swarming the aircraft with the efficient choreography of launch procedures. Durant caught Wolfe's eye across the tarmac, saw his own confusion reflected there. Scrambles happened, but not like this, not with the entire operation staff mobilized, not with the tense energy that crackled through every radio transmission. "Any idea what we're launching into?" Wolfe's voice came through on the discrete frequency as she settled into her cockpit, hands already moving through the startup sequence with the automatic precision of repetition. Durant was running his own checks, eyes scanning instruments while his hands worked controls that had become extensions of his own nervous system. Unidentified aircraft, apparently, but the way they're acting, you'd think it was the second coming. "Stay tight, stay sharp, and let's keep this professional." The turbines spooled up, their rising whine cutting through the desert night, navigation lights casting red and green across the concrete as the two fighters taxied toward the runway in perfect formation. They were airborne in less than 4 minutes from scramble, afterburners painting brief dawn across the darkness as they clawed for altitude, vectoring toward coordinates that placed them on an intercept course with the contact-designated Valkyrie. Durant led, Wolfe tucked into position off his right wing, their aircraft responding to control inputs with the immediate precision that represented billions of dollars of engineering and decades of incremental improvement. The night sky at 40,000 feet existed in shades of black and deeper black, stars scattered overhead with a clarity that made the universe feel simultaneously vast and intimate. Durant's radar showed the contact clearly now, range closing, altitude matching. Nothing about the aircraft's flight profile suggested threat. It flew steady and level, transponder broadcasting clearly, no evasive maneuvers, no indication of hostile intent. But something about the situation felt wrong, felt weighted with meaning that existed beyond the immediate tactical picture. Valkyrie, this is Sabre 1 on your 2 miles. You are being intercepted. Acknowledge. Durant kept his voice neutral, professional, giving no indication of the questions multiplying in his mind. The response came immediately, that same feminine voice carrying a quality he couldn't quite identify, something between exhaustion and absolute certainty. Sabre 1, Valkyrie. I copy intercept. No threat, no emergency. Just coming home. Durant eased his aircraft forward, closing the distance carefully, Wolf maintaining position while her sensors painted the unknown contact with electromagnetic precision. The radar signature matched an F-35C perfectly, but that proved nothing. What mattered was visual confirmation, the evidence of human eyes applying judgment that instruments could not provide. He saw her aircraft first as a shadow against stars, then as a shape that resolved into familiar lines, the distinctive profile of a lightning II that had become as recognizable to him as his own reflection. The aircraft bore standard markings, tail number visible even in darkness thanks to the formation lights that burned steady in the night. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing suggested the kind of catastrophic systems failure that had supposedly claimed this aircraft and its pilot years before. Durant slid his fighter closer, drawing alongside, his eyes searching for details that might explain the impossible. The cockpit was dark except for instrument glow, but he could make out the pilot's helmet, the shape of a human figure in the seat, posture relaxed but alert. Valkyrie, Sabre 1 has visual. Aircraft appears nominal. Confirm you are on a single-engine approach. Standard procedure, establishing facts, building the foundation for whatever came next. Sabre 1, affirmative. All systems green. She's been good to me. Something in that phrase made Durant's breath catch, a possessive familiarity that pilots develop with aircraft they had flown long enough to trust absolutely. He keyed his radio again, this time switching to the command frequency. Tower, Sabre 1, visual confirmation on Valkyrie. Single F-35C, standard markings, aircraft appears flight-worthy. Pilot is responsive and coherent. Advise further instructions. The pause that followed told its own story, voices conferring beyond his hearing, decisions being weighed. When the tower responded, it was Colonel Reeves himself on the line. Sabre 1, maintain escort. Valkyrie is cleared for straighten approach, runway 21. Emergency equipment standing by. Durant acknowledged, then switched back to tactical frequency. Valkyrie, you're cleared for approach. We'll bring you in. The descent began with the methodical precision of routine, though nothing about this situation qualified as routine by any reasonable standard. Wolf had moved to the opposite wing position, giving them visual coverage from both sides, their 3 aircraft forming a loose triangle that tracked downward through layers of atmosphere. Kestrel Thorn, if that was truly who occupied the cockpit of the contact aircraft, flew with the smooth competence of someone for whom the controls had become intuition. Durant found himself studying her aircraft during the descent, searching for evidence of the years she had supposedly been missing. The paint looked fresh, unmarred by the kind of wear that accumulated over time. The surfaces showed none of the small imperfections that marked aircraft subjected to the constant stress of carrier operations. It was as if the jet had been suspended in time, preserved in the moment before its supposed destruction, now returned without explanation or apology. Below them, Nellie's had been transformed. Every light on the base burned bright, emergency vehicles lined the runway in careful spacing, and what looked like half the base personnel had found reasons to be present for this arrival. General Hadley had indeed materialized, her staff car visible near the command center, its headlights painting a small sphere of illumination in the pre-dawn darkness. Durant could imagine the conversations happening in that building, the attempts to apply logic to circumstances that defied ready explanation. His own mind was working through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Classified test program gone wrong. Possible, but the transponder code had been reported lost, not reassigned. Elaborate hoax. The aircraft's signature was too perfect, too consistent with known parameters. Enemy deception. To what purpose? And how would they have obtained not just the aircraft but codes that were supposedly secure? They crossed the threshold at 500 feet, Kestrel's aircraft settling onto the glide slope with textbook precision. Durant and Wolf broke formation as briefed, their fighters peeling away to circle overhead, while Valkyrie made her final approach alone. Durant found himself holding his breath during those last moments, watching the landing lights of the mystery aircraft reflect off the runway surface as the gear came down. 3 positive indications. The aircraft configuration perfect for landing. She touched down with barely a chirp of rubber on concrete, the kind of arrival that made other pilots jealous, the aircraft settling onto its wheels and rolling out with steady deceleration. Fire trucks and ambulances tracked alongside, maintaining distance but ready for crisis. None came. Kestrel Thorne, impossible and undeniable, brought her aircraft to a controlled stop at the designated hardstand, engine spooling down, the sudden quiet after hours of turbine whine feeling almost sacred. Ground crews approached with the mixture of duty and trepidation, wheel chocks positioned, ladders moved into place. The canopy remained closed for a long moment, long enough that Durant, still orbiting overhead, felt tension gathering in his chest. Then it lifted, rising with hydraulic smoothness, and a figure in a flight suit and helmet stood up in the cockpit. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who had been sitting for a very long time, or someone who was not entirely certain her legs would support her weight. The helmet came off, dark hair spilling free, and even at altitude Durant could sense the collective intake of breath from everyone watching. Kestrel Thorne, who should not exist, climbed down from an aircraft that should not be flying, and stepped onto Nevada concrete as if she had never left. Colonel Reeves was the first to reach her, his long strides covering ground with deliberate speed, arriving before security or medical personnel could establish their protocols. He stopped 3 paces away, close enough to confirm what his eyes were telling him, but far enough to maintain the distance that sudden impossibility demanded. Kestrel stood straight, her flight suit showing neither the degradation of years of wear nor the pristine newness that would suggest recent issue. She looked exactly as he remembered, perhaps thinner, perhaps carrying a weariness that went beyond simple physical exhaustion, but unmistakably the pilot who had disappeared over the Pacific. "Major Thorne," Reeves said, and even to his own ears his voice sounded strange, formal in a way that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with confronting the resurrection of the declared dead. "Sir," she responded, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Permission to report as ordered." The phrase was regulation, proper procedure, but delivered with a weight that suggested entire volumes of unspoken story. "You've been declared killed in action, Major. Your aircraft went down 27 months ago. Where the hell have you been?" It was not perhaps the most diplomatic opening, but Reeves had built his career on direct questions and honest answers. Kestrel's eyes met his, and he saw in them something that made him instinctively step back. Not hostility, not fear, but a kind of knowledge that existed beyond his experience, as if she had seen things that could not be adequately translated into language he would understand. "Sir, I've been exactly where I was supposed to be, flying my mission, and now I'm returning to report mission complete." The debriefing room was deliberately neutral, walls painted in institutional beige, furniture functional but not comfortable, lighting bright enough to eliminate shadow but not harsh enough to feel like interrogation. It was a space designed for the extraction of information, for the careful documentation of events that would be analyzed, classified, and filed, according to protocols that had been refined over decades. Kestrel sat at the center of the table, a bottle of water untouched before her, her hands folded in a manner that suggested either perfect composure or absolute exhaustion mimicking calm. Around her, the assembled officers represented multiple agencies, multiple agendas, each viewing her through the lens of their particular concerns. Reeves was present, along with General Hadley, whose silver hair and sharp eyes marked her as someone who had navigated the highest levels of military and political bureaucracy. Two intelligence officers sat with tablets ready, recording devices active and acknowledged. A flight surgeon hovered near the door, present but not participating, watching Kestrel with the clinical attention of someone assessing for signs of trauma or deception. The questions began immediately, establishing baseline facts, confirming identity through details that only the real Kestrel Thorne would know. She answered everything promptly, accurately, providing information that matched records perfectly. Where had she been? Classified airspace, conducting assigned patrol. What happened to her aircraft? Nothing. Systems remained nominal throughout the mission. Why had she been reported as lost? That was not my decision, sir. I maintained radio silence as instructed. The responses were crisp, professional, and completely inadequate. They explained nothing while confirming everything, a verbal dance that Reeves recognized from years of dealing with classified programs and operations that officially did not exist. General Hadley leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. She had been a fighter pilot herself, decades ago, before rising through ranks that rewarded strategic thinking over stick-and-rudder skills. She understood the culture, the codes, the unspoken rules that governed how pilots communicated when formal channels were inadequate or compromised. "Major Thorne," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Not protocol, not evasion, just truth. Were you on a classified mission that this assembly is not cleared to know about?" Kestrel held the general's gaze for 3 heartbeats, then responded with words that seemed to come from some place deeper than mere memory. "Ma'am, I was on a mission that I was not cleared to know about. Everything I experienced, everything I saw, everything I did was compartmented to the point that I could not have explained it even if I had wanted to. I was given orders, I executed those orders, and now I have returned." The room fell silent, each person processing the implications. A mission so classified that even the pilot was kept ignorant of its true nature was not unprecedented, but it was rare, the kind of operational security that suggested stakes beyond normal military priorities. Hadley exchanged glances with one of the intelligence officers, some unspoken communication passing between them. "And your aircraft?" Reeves interjected. "How is it possible that we're looking at an F-35 that was reported destroyed, showing no signs of damage, flying with perfect systems after nearly 3 years?" Kestrel's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in her professional composure, something that might have been sadness or might have been humor at the absurdity of circumstance. "Sir, from my perspective, it's been 72 hours since my last debrief. Whatever time passed here, I didn't experience it the same way." The implications of that statement rippled through the room like concentric circles spreading from a stone dropped into still water. Time dilation, relativistic effects, theoretical physics that existed in textbooks and academic papers, but not, as far as anyone in that room knew, in operational reality. One of the intelligence officers, a man whose credentials identified him as belonging to an agency that did not officially acknowledge connection to military aviation, spoke for the first time. "Major, are you claiming that you experienced temporal displacement?" Kestrel turned to face him, and something in her expression suggested that she had been waiting for this question, that everything prior had been preamble to this central point. "I'm claiming nothing, sir. I'm reporting what I experienced. I was given mission parameters that included navigation through what was described as variable temporal space. I was told that my instrumentation would show impossible readings, that my perception of elapsed time would not match external measurement, and that upon mission completion I should return to base and report. Which is what I'm doing. The officer made notes on his tablet, fingers moving rapidly. And what was the nature of this mission? What were you doing in this variable temporal space? For the first time, Kestrel hesitated, her composure wavering as if she was confronting the limits of what she could articulate. I was flying combat air patrol, sir. Standard intercept profile, but the targets— She paused, seeming to search for words that would not come. The targets were not standard. They weren't enemy aircraft, at least not enemy in any conventional sense. They were intrusions, anomalies. Things that shouldn't be in our airspace, coming from places that don't connect to our geography in normal ways. General Hadley stood abruptly, her chair scraping against linoleum in a sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone out except Colonel Reeves and Agent Morrison. She indicated the intelligence officer who had been asking the temporal questions. This conversation just exceeded the classification level of everyone else in this room. There was a moment of protest, bodies shifting, voices beginning objections, but Hadley's expression brooked no argument. The flight surgeon left reluctantly. The junior intelligence officer closed his tablet with visible frustration, and within 2 minutes the room had emptied to just 4 people. Hadley remained standing, her posture rigid. Major Thorne, I'm going to speak plainly because we're past the point where dancing around the issue serves any purpose. Are you telling us that you've been flying interdiction missions against extra-dimensional incursions? The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible, the kind of statement that belonged in science fiction rather than military debriefing. Kestrel met the general's eyes and nodded once, sharply. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I'm telling you. For the past 72 hours of my subjective experience, I've been flying combat operations in a space where our normal physics don't fully apply, engaging targets that are attempting to penetrate into our reality from adjacent dimensional membranes. And I've been doing it alone, because apparently I was the only pilot who could handle the mission parameters without experiencing complete psychological breakdown. She delivered this statement with the same flat affect she might use to report fuel consumption or weapons expenditure, a professional recounting of duties performed. And you succeeded? Reeves asked, his mind already working through the strategic implications. Did you stop them? Kestrel's expression finally broke, a smile crossing her face that carried no humor whatsoever. I held the line, sir. That's all any of us can do. Agent Morrison had been silent since the room cleared, but now he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming a quiet rhythm on the table's surface. This explains several anomalies we've been tracking. Unexplained radar contacts, atmospheric disturbances that don't match any known weather patterns, gravitational fluctuations in specific geographic locations. We've been operating on the assumption that these were either equipment malfunctions or foreign technology we hadn't identified yet. But if what you're describing is accurate, Major, then we've been fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the threat. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. How did you manage it? Flying alone in that kind of environment, engaging targets that violate our understanding of physics. What training prepared you for this? Kestrel's laugh was short and bitter. No training, sir. They selected me because I had the right psychological profile, whatever that means. Apparently most pilots, when confronted with the visual evidence of things that shouldn't exist, experience cognitive dissonance severe enough to compromise flight capability. I just adapted. When you see something impossible, you can either reject the evidence of your eyes or you can accept that your previous understanding was incomplete. I chose adaptation. She finally reached for the water bottle, her hand steady as she broke the seal and drank. The aircraft helped. Whatever modifications they made to my jet, it interfaced with the variable space in ways that gave me tactical advantage. I could see the incursions forming before they fully materialized, target them while they were still vulnerable. It was like flying through a storm where the lightning strikes were predictable if you knew what to look for. General Hadley had resumed her seat, but her posture remained rigid, the bearing of someone processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions. Who briefed you for this mission, Major? What was the chain of command? It was a reasonable question, the kind that military professionals asked when trying to establish accountability and authority. Kestrel's response was immediate. "I don't know, ma'am. I was approached by individuals who never provided names or agency affiliation." The briefing materials were delivered electronically, viewed once, and then deleted with no recoverable trace. I was told that this level of compartmentalization was necessary because knowledge of the program's existence could itself be dangerous, that information about the incursions could propagate in ways that would facilitate more intrusions. It was need-to-know taken to an extreme I'd never encountered before. Reeves had been listening intently, his expression growing darker as the implications accumulated. "So you're telling us that you've been operating under orders from unknown authority, flying missions that aren't in any official records, engaging targets that officially don't exist, all while maintaining complete radio silence for what we perceived as 27 months. Major, do you understand how this sounds? Do you understand why every protocol and regulation we have would flag this as either a psychological break or an elaborate deception?" Kestrel met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir, I understand completely. And if I were in your position, I would have the same concerns. But I also understand that my aircraft is sitting on your ramp, fully functional, showing no signs of the damage that would be present if it had actually crashed. I understand that my flight logs, if you check them, will show continuous operation during the period I was supposedly dead. And I understand that somewhere in classified databases, there are probably indicators and warnings about the phenomena I'm describing, even if they're not connected or analyzed as part of a coherent picture." Morrison was already working his tablet, fingers moving through secure databases, accessing information streams that required authentication tokens and biometric confirmation. His expression shifted as he read, professional neutrality giving way to something that looked like reluctant confirmation. "She's right. I'm seeing pattern matches across multiple intelligence streams. The temporal signature of her aircraft's transponder shows continuous operation, but with chronological anomalies that our systems flagged as errors. There are incident reports from NORAD, naval intelligence, even civilian aviation authorities describing encounters with unidentified aircraft that appeared and disappeared without following normal flight paths. And," he paused, reading more carefully, "there's a classified research program, special access required, investigating what they're calling reality membrane penetration events. Access is so restricted I can't even see who's running it, but the program overview mentions the possibility of using human operators in boundary patrol roles." He looked up at Kestrel with new assessment in his eyes. "You're telling the truth, or at least, you're telling a truth that matches classified data I barely have access to." Hadley stood again, this time moving toward the door, her decision made. "Colonel Agent Morrison, you're with me. Major Thorne, you're confined to this facility until we can verify your story and determine appropriate next steps. You'll be provided quarters, medical evaluation, and anything else you need, but you don't speak to anyone about this mission. Understood?" Kestrel came to attention, the movement automatic and precise. "Yes, ma'am. Understood." As the senior officers filed out, leaving her alone in the debriefing room, Kestrel finally allowed herself to slump slightly, the rigid discipline giving way to exhaustion that went bone-deep. The quarters they assigned her were officer standard, a small suite with separate bedroom and sitting area, furniture that was functional but showed the wear of decades of use by transient personnel. Someone had thoughtfully provided a fresh uniform, toiletries, and a meal that sat covered on the small table by the window. Kestrel ignored all of it initially, drawn instead to the window itself, which looked out over the flight line. Her aircraft was still visible, surrounded now by maintenance personnel and technical specialists who moved around it with instruments and testing equipment, documenting and analyzing. She wondered what they would find, whether the modifications that had allowed her to fly through spaces where physics behaved differently would be visible to standard inspection, or whether they would appear as normal systems that simply happened to operate at impossible efficiency. The sky beyond the flight line was beginning to lighten, pre-dawn gray replacing the deep black of night. Kestrel watched the transition with the attention of someone for whom the sky had become more than backdrop, had become instead a battlefield where the stakes were measured in the continued stability of reality itself. She thought about the things she had seen during those 72 hours that had somehow consumed 27 months of external time. The incursions had started small, brief flickers of wrongness at the edges of perception, like looking at something from the corner of your eye and seeing movement that disappeared when you turned to face it directly. They had grown progressively larger, more stable, more aggressive in their attempts to force their way into normal space. She had engaged them with weapons that were not really weapons, firing missiles that traveled through paths that were not exactly distance, watching her rounds impact targets that existed in multiple states simultaneously. The kills had been strange, not the clean destruction of conventional combat, but rather a kind of unmaking, targets collapsing back into the probability space from which they had emerged, their existence simply ceasing rather than transitioning to the wreckage and debris of normal physics. She had watched her ammunition counter decrease, felt the aircraft respond to her control inputs, experienced all the physical sensations of combat, but the underlying reality had been different in ways she still struggled to articulate. There had been a moment, somewhere in what she thought of as the middle of her mission, when she had understood with absolute clarity that she was not fighting enemy combatants in any traditional sense. She was fighting the universe's immune response to its own boundaries being violated, serving as a kind of white blood cell at the level of cosmic structure. The realization had been simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, reducing her to insignificance while elevating her role to something that transcended personal identity. She had not been Kestrel Thorne, individual human with personal history and private concerns. She had been a function, a tool, a necessary response to a threat that existed beyond the scale of human politics or national interest. A knock at the door pulled her from reflection. She turned from the window to find Colonel Reeves standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "May I come in, Major?" The formality was deliberate, establishing the nature of their interaction. "Of course, sir." She remained standing as he entered, closing the door behind him. For a moment neither spoke, the silence stretching between them with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid in the official debriefing. Reeves moved to the window, standing beside her, looking out at the same scene. "Your aircraft checks out clean. Perfect condition, all systems nominal, no signs of combat damage or even normal operational wear. It's as if it rolled off the production line yesterday, except that the logs show continuous flight time that adds up to more hours than should be possible given the fuel capacity and known range." He paused, still watching the activity around her jet. "The technicians are terrified, Kestrel. Not of what they're finding, but of what they're not finding. They can't explain it, which means they can't predict it, which means they can't control it. And people in our business don't like things they can't control." Kestrel nodded, understanding the concern without needing further explanation. "What happens now, sir?" Reeves turned to face her, and she saw in his expression a complexity that went beyond their respective ranks. "Honestly, I don't know. This is beyond my experience, beyond my authority to manage. General Hadley is making calls to people whose names don't appear in official directories, accessing programs that most flag officers don't even know exist. You've landed in the middle of something that's been going on at levels of classification that make black budgets look transparent." He hesitated, then continued with visible reluctance. "There are people who want to debrief you extensively, extract every detail of your experience. There are others who think you represent a security risk, that whatever you experienced may have compromised you in ways we can't detect or understand. And there are still others who simply want you to get back in that aircraft and return to wherever you've been. Continue the mission without bothering command authority with inconvenient questions about the nature of reality." "And what do you think, sir?" Kestrel asked the question quietly, genuinely curious about the perspective of the man who had been her commander, who had signed off on the mission that had somehow transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. Reeves was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I think you did something extraordinary. I think you held a line that most people don't even know exists, against a threat that challenges everything we think we understand about how the universe works. And I think you did it alone, without support or backup, because someone decided you were capable of bearing that burden." He focused on her directly, his expression fierce. "I also think you deserve better than to be treated as a convenient tool, to be used and discarded based on bureaucratic expediency. You're an officer, a pilot, a human being with rights and dignity. Whatever happens next, I'm going to fight to ensure you're treated accordingly." Kestrel felt something shift in her chest, a tightness easing that she hadn't fully acknowledged was there. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." They stood together at the window, watching the sun finally break the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The new day brought with it the promise of answers, or at least the promise of new questions that might eventually lead to understanding. On the flight line, her aircraft sat silent and patient, a machine that had carried her through impossible spaces, waiting to learn whether its service would be required again, or whether this landing marked the end of a mission that officially had never begun. The summons came 3 days later, after Kestrel had endured medical examinations that confirmed she was physically healthy, but offered no explanation for how she had survived without apparent resupply for nearly 3 years. The doctors had found no signs of malnutrition, no evidence of long-term isolation stress, no indicators of the kind of degradation that should have been present if her story were true in any conventional sense. Her physical condition matched someone who had been flying for 72 hours, not someone who had been lost for 27 months. It was one more impossibility added to a growing collection. The message directed her to report to a location off base, coordinates that placed the destination somewhere in the desert north of Las Vegas, in terrain that appeared empty on maps, but which likely housed any number of facilities that did not officially exist. She was provided a car, a plain sedan with government plates, and directions that were simultaneously precise and deliberately vague. The drive took her through landscape that was beautiful in its austerity, sand and rock and sparse vegetation, existing under a sky so blue it seemed artificial. She passed through 2 security checkpoints, each staffed by personnel who checked her credentials with thorough professionalism before waving her through.